So here's the new, but yet at the same time not that new, Apple MacBook Pro 13-inch with the new M2 chip. Now we did have our first impressions of the laptop back when we first got it, and to sum up that experience, we have to say that Apple is definitely on the right track when it comes to their own silicon. But the use of this older chassis might be a little bit questionable. Fast forward to today, and we've had the MacBook Pro 13-inch with the new M2 for quite a few weeks now, and we have to say that based on our first impressions, we were actually pretty much on point. But nevertheless, let's dive deeper and talk more about that Apple M2 chip. Now to preface, the M2 chip will be first available with the all-new redesigned MacBook Air as well as this not new but new MacBook Pro 13-inch. Arguably, one is going to be more enticing than the other, but regardless, let's talk about that M2. Apple released the original M1 chip back in November of 2020, and back then it certainly made waves in more ways than one. Since then, we have seen upgrades in the form of the M1 Pro and the M1 Max with the newly redesigned MacBook Pro 14-inch and 16-inch, and not too long ago, the M1 Ultra with the all-new Mac Studio. But now, just recently in June of 2022, we have the new M2 chip, which builds upon the previous architecture and is the start of the second generation of Apple Silicon. The M2 chip is a direct successor to the M1 chip, and in all aspects, it's an upgrade all around. As usual, Apple is taking a vastly different approach from the other major players in the industry. They are still pushing for performance, but they are also really focusing on performance per watt, so in essence, efficiency. Compared to the previous M1 chip, the new M2 chip has over 20 billion transistors built on second generation 5nm technology, which translates to 18% faster CPU performance, 35% faster GPU performance, 40% faster neural engine, up to 24 gigs of unified memory, 100 GB per second of memory bandwidth, and much more. But don't be confused by the numbers and assume that the M2 chip is going to be as huge an upgrade compared to the M1 Pro and M1 Max compared to the M1, because it's not. The M2 sits right between the M1 and the M1 Pro. So if you're looking for a really professional device or you require that additional horsepower or performance from your laptop, more likely than not, you'll still be looking at the M1 Pro or the M1 Max. But with that said, the new M2 is definitely much closer to the M1 Pro as compared to the M1, so let's talk about that. Let's talk about performance. We ran Cinebench R23 as per usual, and we managed to achieve a score of 8693 and 1581 in multi-core and single-core respectively. Compared to the previous M1 chip with a score of roughly 7700 and 1500, this is about a 13% improvement when it comes to multi-core performance in Cinebench R23 specifically. We also ran Geekbench this time around to have a reference per se, and it managed a multi-core score of 8955 and a single-core score of 1915 respectively. Overall, this does put it right around the ballpark of the claims that Apple has made. And of course, your mileage will vary depending on your use case, but one definite improvement is with the flow of video editing itself. This means that it can now also accelerate ProRes and ProRes RAW and also support 8K H.264 and HEVC video. Now we also did our usual test with DaVinci Resolve with our 10-minute test projects. However, do note that the footage used and the export itself aren't ProRes, but just standard high bitrate H.264. So this might not be the best example to showcase the performance uplift that the M2 chip is really capable of. Despite that, we have to say that there's still a solid improvement nonetheless that anyone can definitely appreciate. But apart from the CPU, the GPU does also get an upgrade as well, and there's now also the option to outfit the M2 chip with 2 additional GPU cores for a total of 10 GPU cores. In a controlled benchmark like Geekbench Metal, this does indeed have much improved performance, scoring roughly 30,000, which puts it quite a ways ahead of the previous M1. Now it goes without saying that we did also test some games on macOS natively at both the 1080p resolution and the native resolution of the Retina display. Now of course, we didn't have much to test here, but if you're looking to just get a simple, no-fuss gaming experience, the M2 chip is actually pretty capable. Now jumping in from the future here a little, we do have to mention that Apple has definitely changed up the power and fan curves for the new M2 chip after further testing. It's now quite a bit more aggressive, favoring performance over temperatures. In the most intense of loads, the M2 chip was constantly hovering around 90 degrees Celsius or more with the fans spinning. Clearly, Apple is still favoring lower fan noise over keeping temperatures lower, which isn't unsurprising but definitely a little disappointing. Anyways, back to the studio. Honestly, we have to, and we only can really say that the Apple M2 chip really paves the way for the next generation of Apple Silicon, and it's really impressive. But let's put the M2 chip aside for now because we have to talk about this new yet not new MacBook Pro, the chassis. We are pretty sure that most of you have seen this design of the MacBook Pro. It's already been quite a few years, and yet here we are with yet the same chassis but just with updated internals. So we did cover this quite extensively within our first impressions article. If you want to read that, you can go ahead and check it out via the links down below. But well, here's a quick refresh. You get the slim tapered look that has been a controversy for professionals for the longest time. A pretty good Retina display but basically unchanged since its introduction. You only get two USB-C ports, both of which are Thunderbolt 3, and you have to charge via USB-C here, no MagSafe. Last but not least, while you still get the awesome keyboard and trackpad, no complaints here whatsoever, this does still feature the touch bar. Again, in essence, this is basically the exact same experience that you have gotten with the previous MacBook Pro 13-inch, except this now has M2. And that's basically it. So in contrast to the newer and totally redesigned MacBook Air, and even the already released MacBook Pro 14 and 16-inch, you don't get a better 1080p FaceTime webcam, you don't get a better and larger display, even compared to the new Air, you don't get MagSafe, and definitely not all the extra ports that comes with the other Pro laptops. This really puts the Apple MacBook Pro 13-inch with the M2 chip in a really weird position per se, and it's a position that's practically non-existent. If you're someone who just needs a MacBook and you want to enjoy the new M2 chip, more likely than not, you'll take a look at the MacBook Air, thanks to the new design and everything that's great about it. And if you're not someone who needs that extra performance for your professional workloads, well, the M1 Pro on the 14-inch MacBook Pro is certainly more enticing compared to this. And it's made even weirder when you take price into consideration. A MacBook Pro 13-inch with the new M2 chip with 16 gigs of unified memory and 512 gigs of SSD storage will run you about 2,500 Singapore dollars or 1,700 US dollars. While a MacBook Air with the new M2 chip with the same specs will run you about 2,450 Singapore dollars or 1,700 US dollars as well. And a MacBook Pro 14-inch with again the same specs except with the M1 Pro will run you about 3,000 Singapore dollars or 2,000 US dollars. Now perhaps you might say that compared to the MacBook Pro 14-inch, there is some kind of justification there because you will indeed be getting much better performance with the new M2 chip as compared to the original M1, and you will be saving quite a bit of cash per se. But you do have to ask yourself, does saving that little bit of cash be worth it when you compare the fact that you lose the better display, the better webcam, the better speakers, the better port selection, and arguably even a better keyboard layout? For some, perhaps. But for most of you who are actually looking to get a MacBook Pro, well, the 14-inch just delivers so much more. So unless you are someone who really prefers this design language for the MacBook Pro, or perhaps you really like the touch bar and actually implements it heavily within your workflow, then sure, this might perhaps be the perfect next laptop for you to upgrade to. On that note, it does also feature quite an insane battery life. As noted by many other users and myself included, easily 12 hours of usage, no issues at all. But for the rest of us, this isn't really the sensible option. And yes, we do have the MacBook Air upcoming for a review, and we'll definitely compare the performance difference between the actively cooled M2 on this against the passively cooled M2 on the Air. So definitely click the bell icon to get notifications and stay updated for that. Nevertheless, for now, while this chassis is definitely kind of quote-unquote an interesting decision by Apple to reuse, for obvious reasons really, but the M2 chip itself is definitely really fantastic. It is simply a brilliant chip and it really sets the direction for Apple moving forward. You are definitely interested in what Apple has in store in the future, and since you are at it, Apple should really equip the Mac Mini with the new M2 chip because that's one device that I'm really looking forward to and would definitely benefit from it greatly. So the Apple M2 chip really sets the foundation for the next generation of Apple Silicon moving forward, and we're just going to be really excited to see what Apple has in store down the line. But for now, if you're even looking at the MacBook Pro 13-inch with the M2 chip, we will only suggest that you think hard and think twice. Maybe even thrice or 4 times and many more times. That's really it. If you have any questions, let us know in the comment section down below. If you'd like to, do check out the affiliate links as well. If you do, thanks for the support. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to us on YouTube, follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram and TikTok. Till the next one. See ya!